Marcy, Lucy. All right, I'm gonna share my screen here. All right. Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you everyone for taking the time to come out to this. Obviously this isn't an easy thing to talk about. It's going to be an intense conversation. And I just want everyone to know that it's okay to, take the space that you need. Like if you need to turn your camera off or, have grounding objects. I have rocks and feathers around me right now. Just anything that makes you feel good in the space. Keeping in line with the theme of this visiting series of, visiting. I'm going to try to be as casual as I can throughout this conversation. Have tea and everything. So music, if folks need you, whatever you need to feel comfortable right now and just feel like we're visiting, that would be great because that's the vibe that I'm going for here. So just a quick overview of what we're going to discuss today. I'm just going to, Lucy actually said a lot of things I was going to say in my intro, but I'll just add a little bit more about my family in there. And then I'm going to go through the definition of genocide. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about states as international actors. And then we're going to take a little bit of a health break, 5 minutes, just go to the bathroom, whatever stretch. Then we'll come back and we'll talk about the Genocide Convention from the UN, as well as the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And then we'll also briefly discuss human rights treaties. And then at the end, I'll talk about Indigenous law as an alternative to all the stuff I'm going to be talking about before that. And at the end, there'll be time for Q&A. I'm hoping to keep speaking to about an hour and finish by 8:30, just so respecting everybody's time and capacity. Yeah, so I guess another sort of just thing before entering the PowerPoint slide here. I'm going to be talking about law, but the way that I understand law is through story. I think a lot of the times that I probably should have been a writer instead of going to law school. For my mental health, it probably would have been a lot better, but I like to think about law in terms of story. And so I'll explain a little bit about what that means. But just to sort of tease into what that kind of looks like, I'm just going to mention what this photo is on the PowerPoint slide here, and I was on the image as well of the event ad. And so this is on display at the United Nations headquarters in New York. It is obviously a revolver that is knotted. It was a gift from Luxembourg to the UN, and it was done by a Swedish artist in honor of John Lennon, and it's supposed to be a symbol for like anti-war and anti-violence all around the world. And so this is the image I chose because one, it's from the UN, and we're going to be talking about the UN a little bit today, but also because of the stories that aren't told at the UN. And as an Indigenous person at the UN and seeing an image like this, especially in New York, where it's one of the first points of contact, just thinking about that story of war that doesn't really get told at the UN. And yeah, so this image is just sort of the prelude to that. All right, so Tanche, hello, bonjour. My name is Breanne. Lucy already said a lot of the things I was going to talk about, as I had mentioned. But I'm gonna, I guess, quickly say, why I'm focusing so much on Red River Echoes right now. In fall of 2020, I started an LLM at McGill University, where I was going to focus on Métis law and Métis constitutionalism. And at that point, I had lived in Montreal for 4 years and had been away from Winnipeg for that long, and really didn't have much sense of community. And just doing a master's with a thesis on Métis law when I wasn't connected to community felt really icky to me, especially because I had just moved back home like during the summer of 2020, and I was starting my master's online, and I just was like, why am I trying to validate Métis law for settlers and like legal scholars when I could like be letting Métis people know that there even is Métis law, because until I went to law school, I didn't even know that that was like a thing, you know, that we had our own legal systems and that they were valid and that they were, you know, like legitimate things that we could look to, instead of, you know, just the systems that, you know, were designed to oppress us. So that's why I get so excited about Red River Echoes. Most folks who know me know I talk about law a lot, and I see law in everything. Our music, our beadwork, our art, everything carries stories. And like I said, stories are law. And yeah, so I think that should be good for the prep. We're going to start going into some more technical stuff here about genocide. So just letting everybody know that that's where we're headed next. So this is oh, oops. Sorry, folks. That's not necessary. All right, so this is a photo I took in Ottawa during Canada 150. I had the happy fortune of working at the Department of Justice in Ottawa during the summer of Canada 150. Was not great. And then this is a photo from that time. And at that time I had just finished my first year of law school, and, you know, had just sort of realized like the weight of violence that comes with the law for Indigenous peoples. So yeah, so the genocide, here's the definition that you would find if you were to look up the definition in a dictionary. Obviously the legal definition is a little bit more complex, but the word genocide itself was coined by Raphael Lemkin. He was a Polish Jewish lawyer, and he coined the word, he was in 1944, so tail end of the Holocaust. And so the roots of the word, I like etymology. I think it's helpful just to really know what the words mean. So geno is the Greek for race, and then side is Latin for kill. So it literally means race kill, if you think about it in that way, as just like the bare bone definition of what genocide means. But so prior to Raphael Lemkin coining this word genocide, the crime of genocide itself as like an international crime didn't exist. And so just thinking about that just because the crime didn't exist, it doesn't mean that genocide didn't happen. Obviously, you know, as Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, we know that genocide occurred before 1944. Yeah, and so just another note about the word genocide. I remember one time hearing Maria Campbell say that words have bundles. And so I like to think about what I don't like to think about, but have been forced to through my academic choices, to think about the bundles of genocide and, you know, the very serious implications that come with creating law, especially Western conceptions of law, where law is very rigid and very relies on categories to the point where it becomes difficult to be that specific. And I'll get more into what that means later on. But yeah, those are just some of the thoughts around genocide. All right, okay, so what stories do we tell about genocide? So this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about law and story and sort of the inception of the word genocide. So one of the main stories I think that we all know about genocide is the story of World War II and the Holocaust, and primarily because that is where the definition of genocide comes from. And so this is the key story of genocide in international law is sort of the creation of the UN and the development of international human rights law that followed at this time. So before this point in history, there wasn't this sort of global concerted effort, at least this is sort of the Western narrative of it, up until World War II, there had never been a global effort to address the atrocities that human beings do to one another. And so the UN was created out of this story of genocide. And the story, we tell it all the time. We tell stories about, especially the story of World War II, as, so I'm just going to take a sip here. The story of World War II is told within a good guys versus bad guys narrative often, especially within Canada as, you know, a member of the Allied forces. And certainly, of course, Nazis were bad. There's no like doubt about that. But the creation of the binary of Nazis were the bad guys and creating good guys out of the Allied forces when the Allied forces were predominantly colonial empires, I think misses a huge part of the story. And often a lot of this has to do with the fact that this is warfare, and winners of war, victors control justice following warfare. So you'll see this reflected later on in the creation of the UN Security Council, how victors of war are able to secure power for themselves as states. And I'll also explain a little bit more about what the UN Security Council does and what its function is. But anyway, so we all know the story, you know, of the patriotic American or Canadian soldier rushing in and liberating Europe from Nazi Germany. But there are some important omissions from this of that story, and stories that have a lot to do with genocide. So one, for example, is Hiroshima and the development of the atomic bomb. The US attack on Hiroshima, I think, is the single greatest one moment of a crime against humanity that was so unspeakable. And there has never been any sort of international repercussions for what the United States did. And you know, you see the impacts of that today still. And we know what the development of the atomic bomb led to. And again, here, not to play you know, devil's advocate for the USSR here, but the USSR did play an important role in stopping the Nazis. That story also is conveniently taken out for the purposes of the Cold War following World War II. But other things that it sort of glosses over in the history of World War II, where the US is the good guy or Canada is the good guy, Britain's a good guy, is that there was rampant anti-Semitism here as well. You know, it was never about the generosity of these countries to save people from Hitler's tyranny. It was purely out of state interest, at least from my perspective and how I've experienced the international world so far. And another obviously big part that's not told in that story is that Allied countries were colonists. And you see that in the development of the Trusteeship Council originally with the UN, which was created, you know, because all of these countries that just were trying to, you know, create human rights laws for all states to comply. You know, a lot of these countries had colonies, and you know, you can't say that you're a human rights leader while also being a colony. However, Canada has done a great job at, you know, working around that through some clever politics. And yeah, another aspect of what stories we tell is that Hitler's genocide didn't occur in a vacuum. And the blueprint of, you know, the legal infrastructure, so to speak, of how Nazi Germany was able to so successfully administer through a bureaucracy the extermination of a people. It was learned from the Indian Act and the construction of the way that our laws in Canada were. And you know, as a law student, this was something that really struck me when I was studying law, was that in first year constitutional law, you learn about the division of powers in the Constitution. So that's what where the provincial jurisdiction is outlined versus federal jurisdiction. And, you know, the way that I would relate to, you know, being an object of the law instead of a subject of it, you know, that Indians and land reserved for Indians is part of federal jurisdiction, but you know, as I think there was only a couple Indigenous law students in my cohort, you know, no one else in our class saw themselves reflected in the division of powers in the Constitution, and the way that makes you feel really small, you know, like that the law in Canada sort of, you know, just fits us in alongside of all of the other things that it wants to regulate. And about how that's still so embedded within Canada and its genocidal project. Another aspect of stories about genocide that's important to mention here is the important work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and how much work was done to share those stories. In international law, from that sort of perspective, the fact that Canada had a TRC was actually really interesting. TRCs are typically used for post-conflict situations. And so obviously there was no like active warfare that resulted in Canada's TRC. And so that makes the TRC here very unique. And I think it's good to ask ourselves why it was necessary to have a TRC. And what that says about Canada's willingness to make political concessions without actually making real tangible concessions. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the MMIW final report and how that also changed the story of genocide in this country. But I think not in the way that maybe some folks expect, because I know that Justin Trudeau, like after the final report came out, he had made that comment about, he sort of conceded that genocide had occurred. But I think now, because it's been so, like from the TRC, the idea that the genocide has been cultural, and this is something we'll explore later as well, that's really prominent. And I think what the MMIW report did was it took the TRC and placed it into the present, because it said these aren't things that happened in residential schools up to 1997 when the last one closed. These were, you know, this is ongoing genocide and Canada isn't doing anything about it. And what a bold thing to say, you know, like out of the final report. But I will say another aspect of the MMIW report that I think is important to consider, especially in what we're talking about here with genocide and stories. I think it was, maybe I was in my first or second year of law school, but Marilyn Poitras came to McGill to give a talk about the MMIW process, and it was at that time she had just stepped down from being the head of the commission, and she spoke to us about the way the process of the MMIW inquiry was set up, and about how embedded within the process were assumptions about Indigenous peoples that already made the inquiry itself miss the mark, I suppose. And how she framed it was that the way in which the process was for the MMIW report would be like if post-Nazi Germany, we created an inquiry and we asked Jews what they did to be the targets of the Nazis, instead of asking the Nazis why they did what they did. And so that the MMIW report focuses on the stories of the women, and not that that's not important, but our women aren't doing anything wrong. You know, there are people, we know who's killing them, and that we don't act on that is part of this story that Canada tells itself about who it is. Yeah, okay, I'm just watching the time here. And then another sort of just small thing to consider. I'm talking about stories of genocide at sort of like a broader level, but we tell stories about genocide all the time. You know, everything from like Avatar to Avengers, like these movies are telling stories of genocide. And, you know, I think even Dune, like a recent movie that came out, like these are stories about genocide that we retell over and over again with different heroes. and different saviors, sort of in the way that the US and Canada and Britain, et cetera, have created themselves as saviors following World War II through the human rights regimes that they set up at the international level. Okay, now getting even more technical. So this stuff, if anyone has any questions, just let me know. I'm hoping to try to summarize an international law class into a little PowerPoint, so bear with me. So states, as I said at the beginning, are the central organizing figure of international law. So states are, the main vehicle for conducting international relations. This is something I think we all know. But this isn't something that we should take for granted. It hasn't always been this way. The world has not always been organized through states. And states have been the central actors, however, though, since the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Sorry, I'm just going to put a little caveat here too. I'm also speaking from a Western perspective here of what states are. As a Métis person, I have very different ideas about what a state is. But anyways, yeah. So states are the central actors, and to be recognized as a state must have a defined territory, have a permanent population, exercise control over their territory, and have the capacity to enter into relations with other states. So this criteria for states developed following the Peace of Westphalia, which was the end to the 30-year war in Europe. I don't pay much attention to the wars in Europe, but it's after a lot of fighting in Europe, and they created this Peace of Westphalia. And central to this was the idea of state sovereignty. And so states under international law are sovereign, and they are the most sovereign entities that exist under international law. And another important thing to note here about the criteria for states, here number 4, having the capacity to enter relations with other states, is sort of the subjective criteria of international law. And I know things might seem really black and white in international law, but there is actually quite a lot of gray space. So for example, we'll take the territory of Palestine, has a defined territory, a permanent population, and they exercise control over their territory. However, not all states recognize Palestine as a state and thus don't engage with relations with Palestine. Similar for Taiwan. And so their statehood is contentious, but it doesn't mean that it's not real or true. Especially, thinking about ourselves as, Indigenous peoples. As far as I'm concerned, I think we meet that criteria. And, historically, this is just how humans have organized. We, on our territories, knew where it was, we knew who our people were, and we took care of them. So instead of exercising control, maybe thinking of it as like an Indigenous perspective would be like exercising care over your territory. And then we entered into relations with others. So international law isn't so far away from what we as human beings already do. And there's a large body of international law called customary international law that sort of speaks to that. And then another point that I have here is that states have a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. So this is a sort of classic liberal theory idea of the function of the state. And so here the idea, I think one of the most useful examples I've ever heard was from a professor when I was at the University of Winnipeg. I can't remember his name right now, but he was explaining the difference between states that use Islamic law versus a state like Canada that has like sort of liberal Western legal systems. Was the example of violence against women, was that in Western societies, we think that as a society, we don't like condone violence against women, that we're not like that. And there's a lot of othering that goes on with Islamic states in terms of like how their treatment of women may be perceived. Also not going to speak too much to that. I'm just sort of speaking to the othering aspect. But that actually, that's not true, that as a society, we don't believe that violence against women is wrong. It's only the state that's allowed. So if that makes sense to folks, how it was explained to me at the time was that like here in generally society here, if a woman were to be arrested on the street, that would be, you know, whatever, that's just the police doing their job, whenever. But if we were in an Islamic state, a stranger wouldn't have the authority to touch a woman, only her husband would. And so it's not that we have a problem with violence against women, it's that the men who commit violence against women have to have a badge. So that's sort of just my little caveat there for what that means, especially because states are the primary instigator of genocide, obviously. Yeah, okay, and we're going to just talk a little bit about the consequences of this. So states as sovereign entities that are allowed to be violent and who are protected through international law because of ideas of what state sovereignty means. The UN was created for, like, you know, all of the good intentions that went into it. This is Article 2.1 here of the UN Charter, is the organization, so the UN is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all of its members. And so this is the founding, you know, this is the unquestionable thing about the UN, is that sovereignty will always take priority over the human rights aspect of the UN's work. State sovereignty is the most sacred, like I think I can only use the word sacred to describe the way that sovereignty and state sovereignty in particular is reified. Yeah, and then so the only exception within the UN Charter to the sovereignty of states is an action taken by the UN Security Council. So here, Article 39 of the UN Charter says, the Security Council shall determine the existence of any threat to the peace, breach of the peace, or act of aggression, and shall make recommendations or decide what measures shall be taken to maintain or restore international peace and security. So this is what gives the UN Security Council the authority to authorize interventions into states if there were to be human rights breaches. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about why that doesn't really ever work in practice. But it's important to remember that this is sort of the only like lawful breach within the UN framework of state sovereignty that's permitted. Yeah. Right. So these are our states, and we're going to be talking a lot about states in the next slide again, because we'll be talking about the UN. But here it is. The UN, I think, is a story about human rights, but it's also a story about states. As an institution, the UN is composed of states. There's 193 member states. Some states like Palestine have different status and are able to sit in but don't have voting powers. And so the UN is a source of binding and non-binding international law. And so binding law would be something like a treaty or a convention. So for example, the Genocide Convention that we'll be looking at is binding. And what that means is that there are accountability mechanisms built into that, and states are bound by their requirements. Non-binding international law, so items such as UNDRIP, unfortunately, also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is sort of the, I guess, bedrock of human rights law as an international project. And when signing treaties, so when states are participating in these treaty making processes at the UN. So for example, within the Genocide Convention, as states are participating and creating these laws together, it's possible for states to make reservations. But reservations can't be made so much that it like ruins the intention of the treaty. So basically you can't like make reservations to the point where you no longer are preventing or punishing genocide, for example. And here I'll just quickly go over briefly the way the UN works. So it has 6, and originally had 6 organs. And the last one is now defunct, but I'll talk a little bit about it at the end here because I think it's really interesting. But so the General Assembly, that's what this image is here too. The General Assembly is the main body of the UN. I think it's the one that most folks are used to seeing. Resolutions pass through the General Assembly. It's sort of like the legislative body. So it's like their parliament version, I guess, to compare it to domestic law. And resolutions pass with 2/3 majority. I'm not too sure if I had mentioned that. And so often, this is like where you'll see like, like Greta Thunberg give her like speeches and different things like that. This is that space at the UN. And the next most important aspect of the UN that's important to know is the Security Council. So the Security Council is made up of 5 states, and those 5 states do not change. And those states are the United States, Britain, France, China, and Russia. They are the 5 states that have veto power forever within the UN. So I think those like 5 states never rotate or anything. Like there's never any changing. They never step out. So those 5 are always the decision makers, and there is no like nothing within the UN Charter or within the UN system that makes changes to the power that those states have possible. And so what this veto power means is that, and remember that the UN Security Council is the only body that can authorize action that would breach state sovereignty for the purposes of maintaining international peace and security. So if there's a human rights atrocity being committed, the UN Security Council is the only body that's able to authorize an intervention. So, in practice, you think this would work great. However, politics are a very real thing, and it's had catastrophic impacts because of the way the UN has been structured in this way. And so basically, the UN Security Council has embedded those 5 actors, so the United States, Britain, France, China, and Russia, as the deciders of when to intervene in human rights interventions. So that's a very powerful body, obviously. And we'll talk a little bit more about the consequences of that as well. And then the Economic and Social Council, shorthand UN speak, is called ECOSOC. And ECOSOC does a lot of like social type work. So things like the Sustainable Development Goals, a lot of that sort of work happens at ECOSOC. The Secretariat, that's where the Secretary General lives, and that's sort of the administrative body of the UN. And then there is the International Court of Justice, which is the, we'll talk a little bit more about it in further depth after the health break as well, but basically it is the court for the UN. So any sort of treaties, any sort of treaty disputes, the International Court of Justice will be the court that will hear that. And also, so the Trusteeship Council, so there were 11 trust territories that were, former colonies at the time of the UN being launched, I guess, so to speak. And the role of the Trusteeship Council was basically to oversee the I don't want to call it a decolonization process because I don't think that's really what it was, but it was to oversee the self-determination, self-government, basically these countries achieving independence by, French or British colonial authorities leaving. And so there was a whole UN organ that was devoted to overseeing that process. And obviously we know that that was not the case for settler colonial states like Canada, the US, or Australia. Yeah, okay, and then so just one final note before the health break here, we'll take 5 minutes, but for all of the UN system and for all of the good intentions that have gone into the creation of the UN, there's still no enforcement power to any of its projects. And so peacekeepers, UN peacekeepers, aren't the equivalent of police. So there's really no way for the UN to sort of monitor and enforce these things in a way that doesn't require like years and years of litigation through international means. Because another requirement for if you were to say, say I wanted to take Canada to the UN for a breach of whatever human rights law, I would first have to exhaust all domestic remedies. So that means that I would have to go through the court and all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada before international recourse would even be available. And I'm sure most folks know how long court cases take for Indigenous peoples. And so things move really slow in terms of enforcement powers of the UN, that it's a very reactive system. It's not a preventative one. But yeah, I'll end there for right now, and we'll just come back in 5 minutes if that's okay for everyone. All right. Thanks everyone for coming back. So here we're going to get into some more detail about the actual genocide legislation. So I know sometimes, these definitions can be a lot to read, especially as peoples who have survived genocide. And so I just want to make sure that everyone's keeping that in their, just keeping space for yourself. So the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide was created, by way of the regular treaty-making process in the UN in 1948, entry into force in January 1951. So an important aspect to remember about the UN Genocide Convention is that only states are party to the convention. So what that effectively means is that heads of state cannot be punished for crimes. So for example, if the UN Genocide Convention had existed at the time of the Holocaust, Germany could be brought to the International Court of Justice under the Genocide Convention, but Hitler himself could not. And so this has a lot to do with international law and the function of the state. It's a similar reasoning. You see parallels of the state and corporate law, where there's the corporate veil that protects boards of directors from legal recourse for their bad governance decisions. Something similar exists for heads of state. So that's a helpful way to think about it. And so Article 9 of the Genocide Convention states that any disputes arising from the convention, so any sort of breach of the convention, shall be submitted to the International Court of Justice. And so that's outlined in the convention itself. And so, for example, when I mentioned reservations, that could not be something that you could reserve yourself out of, for example. And that's also because all states that are members of the UN, the International Court of Justice has jurisdiction. But I'm just going to, if folks want to read the definition over here, I think that we all know that those things happen to Indigenous peoples, not just historically, but in present day. So here the definition is any acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, such as, so here are the acts that would be considered genocide. So killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to the members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Just thinking about Williams Lake First Nation right now, and as all over this land, we are unearthing the bodies of babies that were killed. It's really something to know, in your heart, to know that genocide is occurring, but to know that lawyers have made it such, fancy lawyers in New York and Geneva have made it such that it's almost impossible for us to get justice. And I'll explain that a little bit more here. But I just wanted to, as I talked about the definition of genocide, to honor all of, take that moment, because we know that this is happening right now, and this is our lived reality as Indigenous people. We can't ignore that, and we shouldn't. We should be really pissed off about this. And yeah, so just thinking about the babies always in this. So if we wanted to go to the ICJ, this is the process here. So this is from the UN Charter. So here it basically just says that the International Court of Justice is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, and all members are parties to the Court of Justice, as I had mentioned. And here in Article 94, I'll just bring your attention here to each member of the United Nations undertakes to comply with the decision of the International Court of Justice in any case to which it is a party. And then 94.2 there is basically the Security Council has the ability to enforce rulings. So remember what I had said before about the UN Security Council as well. So in practice, Article 94 does not happen. In 1986, Nicaragua took the United States to the International Court of Justice. And the case was about the United States arming the Contras against the Sandinistas. So they were arming a group to try to overthrow the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and also for mining their harbors. So this is what the United States was doing. Nicaragua brought them to the ICJ for these breaches of international law, and the United States refused to participate in the international court's proceedings. And then the court still was able to go through with the case, even though the US refused to participate, and the US was ultimately found guilty. However, because the US refused to participate and there's no enforcement mechanism for these decisions, the US has Nicaragua has never had justice for their ruling with the International Court. The United States has continued to ignore it, and there were 6 resolutions that went to the UN Security Council, all of which were, of course, vetoed by the United States. So here's the tricky part, right, of these mechanisms, is that some of the main offenders of international law are very politically comfortable through strategic multilateral language that they use, rhetoric, narratives, especially Canada. Canada has really leveraged itself on the international scale as this team player. And, we have to remember that Canada enjoys that reputation to its allied friends. And all of these systems, so including the International Court of Justice, have been set up so that there's really no way to really find accountability. And yeah, that's this aspect of the Genocide Convention. And so just for an example about what this could look like for Canada. So currently, the Gambia is the country that brought Myanmar to the International Court of Justice under the UN Genocide Convention, and this happened in 2019. So the Gambia, a small country, because they are party to the Genocide Convention, and so is Myanmar, they were able to submit a request to the court to hear the case, and it went through. And so technically, it would be possible for, say, El Salvador to bring Canada to the ICJ for breaches of the Genocide Convention, especially because the Genocide Convention, another unfortunate thing about law that's written is that dates really matter. And so if a crime occurs 2 years before the crime was a crime in law, then there's no way to punish that thing. So because genocide wasn't technically an international crime until the UN made it one, anything that happened before that time, anything that happened before 1944 doesn't count. It can't be litigated on. And so that's a real barrier, as we'll see later on as well. Yeah, so just to consider that, it technically would be possible for another country to bring Canada to the ICJ, especially because there definitely are atrocities that occurred against Indigenous peoples post 1944, as we all know. Okay, so this is one option. This is one recourse. This is through the UN system. And now we're going to be shifting gears a little bit and looking at the International Criminal Court. So this is the second option for finding criminal liability. And so it was created in Rome. That's why it's called the Rome Statute of the Court, while the court itself is housed The Hague in the Netherlands. Entered into force in July 2002. So again, the caveat there about dates and crimes, the International Criminal Court doesn't have jurisdiction to hear anything that occurred prior to the time that it entered into force. And the Rome Statute and the ICC generally was established as a result of an international failure to uphold the UN Genocide Convention. For all of the reasons that I spoke about before, states have been really reluctant to hold one another accountable for genocide, I think because they're all guilty of it. And so no one's going to open that, unless you have brave small countries like the Gambia. I don't know, if any country is really willing to be the one to take Canada, for genocide, at least not that I know of so far. Maybe that's what the plan is, but I don't know. And so another reason for this was, and I think that what gave the international community the political will to go through with the International Criminal Court at the time was because of the need to have created the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. So, in the early 90s, there was the genocide that occurred in Rwanda, and the international legal community had no way to respond, despite the UN being a thing. There was no interventions that were made, and I'm sure a lot of folks know that story. And I didn't really think I was going to talk about this right now, but I think it's also really interesting Canada's role with Romeo Dallaire in Rwanda, I think was a really big morale booster to Canada's international image as a human rights leader, and not to discredit any of the work that Romeo Dallaire had done in his life, but just to think about the ways that story has been used for the benefit of Canada. And so these following Rwanda, the genocide in Rwanda, and following the genocide in Yugoslavia in the late 90s, the international community was sort of exhausted with trying to deal with the ongoing violence that was going on in the world. And so following Rwanda, an international criminal tribunal was set up, and same for Yugoslavia. And these tribunals, I think both of them only finished in recently, even though these were from the 90s. They were extremely complicated, very intense processes for trying to hold heads of state accountable. So how I mentioned in the Genocide Convention that heads of state can't be held accountable. That's one of the gaps that the International Criminal Court was also trying to fill. So in Rwanda, for example, the way that the ICTR was structured was really interesting. And there's really a lot of nuances in considering the impact of it. The ICTR combined, I guess, an Indigenous legal model, I guess that's the best way I could describe it, for justice for Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda, called Gacaca courts. And they were courts where it was basically just like sitting together in a circle and speaking truth. And so a lot of people in Rwanda, that was the process that was used for finding accountability post-genocide. And then what ended up happening was sort of, mid-level people genociders who were responsible. So people who were making decisions in terms of the genocide. Those who were most responsible ended up, going to prison in The Hague, where the court is, or where the court was established. And meanwhile, the folks who were less responsible were held in prisons in Rwanda. And so I'm sure you can imagine that a prison in the Netherlands is a lot nicer than a prison in Rwanda. And so effectively, those who were most responsible ended up being those held least accountable. They never had to face their victims in the same way as in the Gacaca courts. And so there's a lot of questions about whether or not, what was the point of that? Was the ICTR just for the international community to alleviate themselves of some sort of guilt for not having intervened and for having watched a genocide occur? And so there's lots of questions about that. And I think all of that feeds into the understanding of the International Criminal Court. And so just a final note too about this, the International Criminal Court is considered complementary to national criminal jurisdictions. So effectively what that means is if a country can prove that they are handling whatever atrocities domestically, then the court won't intervene. So if Canada was to say, look, we have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that we did, we've sort of dealt with that issue. The court is, that could be something that they consider. I know that there was no criminal responsibility at all with the TRC, but for reasons that I'll say in a minute, I don't know if that's something that we could realistically expect from these bodies. And so just a final note here on the Rome Statute's definition of genocide. It is pretty much, I think it's actually verbatim, the Genocide Convention definition, so I won't reread it. But just to know that it's the same, and that, the same sort of things that we know are happening to us here are on that list. Yeah, okay, let's see. I think that's all for this part of it. Okay, so say someone wanted to bring a case before the International Criminal Court. This is the process for it. Not all states fall under the jurisdiction of the court. Only signatories to the Rome Statute fall under the jurisdiction of the court. So notably, the United States has not signed, obviously, the International Criminal Court's founding statute. Canada has, though. So Canada is a party to the ICC, so there is jurisdiction there. So here is Articles 13 and 14 from the Rome Statute. And this is outlines the situations in which a case could appear before the International Criminal Court. And so the court has a prosecutor. And so a state party can refer a situation to the prosecutor. The Security Council can refer a situation to the prosecutor, or the prosecutor can take their own independent investigation. And so this seems like it might be like somewhat clear cut, but it's actually quite difficult in terms of establishing jurisdiction with the court. Just in the things that I've learned from from law profs and different things in terms of actually meeting the definition of genocide. It's quite difficult. So I'll use a quick example here. So Myanmar, with the Rohingya genocide, Myanmar is not a signatory to the ICC. However, Bangladesh, which neighbors Myanmar, is a party. And so when Rohingya were forcibly displaced into Bangladeshi territory, it created the opportunity for jurisdiction. But even in that case, the crime itself was forced displacement, which is a crime against humanity. It's not genocide. Genocide is a different crime. And so even though we know that there's an ongoing genocide against the Rohingya, the best you could do to create jurisdiction at the ICC was to create jurisdiction via Bangladesh. And so these are, I think it requires a lot of legal creativity and a lot of logical backflips sometimes, I think, to have these things be taken seriously by these courts. And yeah, okay. I think we'll just go into the next part here where I'm going to detail a little bit more about the two different options. So this is what would need to happen. So essentially, a state like Canada could either ask the ICC, not that they ever would, ask the ICC to look at what occurred. If they were acting in good faith, that probably would be what they would do. Or the prosecutor takes their own investigation. And in terms of the Security Council creating a resolution, I don't think that that's even within the realm of possibility. So here we go. So options for accountability. So at the International Court of Justice, we know for sure, I'm not going to spend too much time trying to convince anybody that genocide occurred, because I think we all know that. So at the International Court of Justice, Article 2 of the UN Genocide Convention has been breached by Canada, even post 1944. So we would need the state to initiate limited ability to ensure enforcement or compliance, as was seen with Nicaragua's case. And the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, is primarily a dispute resolution mechanism. So it really is there to settle disputes about treaties. It's less about human rights, and it's less about accountability to human rights. And it's more about, following, very complex international legal procedures about treaties. So that's important to keep in mind in terms of the ICJ and whether or not that's a route that we would, ever be interested in pursuing as Indigenous peoples. And then at the International Criminal Court, so again, we can confirm that Canada has committed genocide pursuant to Article 6 of the Rome Statute. And I think that past 2002, I think that we can say that that's true. For a whole host of reasons that I'm not going to get into, just because this is already difficult enough to talk about. Yeah, so those would be the route that we would have to follow. Is, as I mentioned, those three options referred to the prosecutor. So it's really at the will of the prosecutor. Possibility for holding heads of state accountable. I would love to see Jean Chrétien go to prison for what he's done. But I don't think that that's something that would ever happen. In addition to difficulties in establishing jurisdiction, the last point is that the International Criminal Court has already refused to hear a case about residential schools. So in June 2021, a coalition of lawyers, and I think mostly Indigenous lawyers, submitted a request to the prosecutor about unmarked graves. And in November, the ICC refused to hear the case. And I wasn't able to find much in terms of like what the court's reasoning was to not hear it, but I found an article where the lawyer, or one of the lawyers involved in drafting the request, stated that the court was concerned that the deaths occurred before the human rights laws of the Rome Statute were in place. So again, that question of timing. And another sort of caveat here to remember is that the law tells violent stories, and that those stories aren't necessarily always fully true. And so I think it's important to remember that in terms of how the law sees genocide, as even though we can experience it holistically as Indigenous peoples in our bodies, we know what genocide feels like, we experience it every day. But, to have a court say, we need X amount of bodies in this gruesome of a way to meet the threshold of what genocide is. And to what it's really similar to domestic criminal law, like victims of violence under criminal law are extracted from all the time in criminal law. So yeah, I think that this is just, it's important to remember that I think to fit the definition of genocide, I think we compromise something. And I think lawyers, I love all the lawyers in my life, but I think lawyers, make a lot of compromises in the name of the rule of law. And, that has consequences. And another final note too about the International Criminal Court is that it's really a court of political will. And again, I don't really know what the appetite is from the international community to accuse Canada to the point where they would actually bring them to court for their treatment of Indigenous peoples. And from my time at the UN, I know that Canada is very much celebrated in those spaces. So it's really, it's a really big tension of those spaces, that the inherent violence of the countries that are seen as the leaders is not told in their story, so they don't tell the full truth. And I think that's important to remember. And just a small caveat too about the International Criminal Court is that a lot of criticism about it is that it basically was created as a court to punish warlords in Africa. That sort of, and if you look at the history of the court, that seems to be who the court is most interested in pursuing. So, all of these, the white supremacy that is inherent to Canada is embedded within the international legal system as well. So, yeah. And I'm going to mention this point as well. While I was in law school and taking international criminal law courses and learning all of this, obviously, the forcible removal of children, to me at least, is a very clear, residential schools was the forcible removal of children with the intent to kill the Indian and the child. And any sort of deviation from that, I think, takes away from the truth of the atrocities that happened. And I think it's really important to always be very clear about what we're talking about when we talk about residential schools as not just a project of wanting to harm us culturally, but it was very deliberately to reduce our population for the purposes of land theft. Yeah. But in my international criminal law class, the reasoning that my law professor, who himself is an international lawyer who practices, has quite an extensive international law practice, his reasoning was that residential schools don't fit under that category because it's related to genocide is related to biological destruction, not cultural destruction. And his argument was that what Canada did was taking children away to erase their cultural heritage. It wasn't to reduce their population, but that's also because the Canadian story is not one that includes the story of land theft. I think a lot of Canadians think Canada sort of just popped up out of nowhere and was their true north, strong and free, but obviously we know that that's not true. yeah, so I think the truth of land theft is something that, is really missing here. And I think it's something that Canadians, because they themselves, if you're a Canadian, you're a landowner, you've participated in, land theft and the genocide of Indigenous peoples. And that's not, to freeze people and make people feel guilty. That's just true. And we need to be able to accept that if we're going to be able to take action to make change. So yeah, just considering the impact of the use of cultural as a qualifier to genocide, and how that, how the story of the TRC and how the TRC's use of cultural genocide may have limited some of our options in terms of how, of telling our truth, because I think a lot of Canadians were really comfortable once they heard, oh, it wasn't a real genocide, it was a cultural genocide. But I don't think that that's true. And I think a lot of us know in our bodies and our hearts and our spirits that that's not true. So basically, I don't really think any of these options of the ICC or the ICJ, I don't think either of those courts are interested in finding Canada guilty of genocide. And so what about human rights treaties? So this is something to consider, that we have human rights treaties like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, a whole bunch of different treaties that protect human rights. But to go through that process, again, as I had mentioned, you have to exhaust all national recourse first, which can take years. And I don't think we have years. We have youth who are being shot by police officers, and no one's held accountable. That sounds like genocide to me. And, I'm not interested in trying to fit those stories into a narrative that the UN is comfortable with. And finally, human rights treaties, again, anything through the UN system, the supremacy of the state is paramount. And as Indigenous peoples, that sort of poses a huge problem to us, because the state, especially as Indigenous peoples in so-called Canada, the state has very effectively created an image of itself to the international world, and has silenced our stories and our truths for a very long time. So I'm just going to share this quote here before my final slide. Kostas Douzinas is I think he's a Greek lawyer, thinker, but this quote, I read it, it's in his book called The End of Human Rights. And this quote, I think sort of is if I had to dwindle down my philosophy on human rights into something, it would be this quote. And it's that official thinking and action on human rights has been entrusted in the hands of triumphalist column writers, bored diplomats, and rich international lawyers in New York and Geneva, peoples whose experience of human rights violations is confined to being served a bad bottle of wine. In the process, human rights have been turned from a discourse of rebellion and dissent into that of state legitimacy. And so anytime that we would go to the UN, we are affirming state legitimacy. We are affirming those systems that the state has created for itself. And that's not our only option. And I think that's really empowering to remember. And, as a Métis person, thinking about rights in a way that's framed in the discourse of rebellion and resistance obviously gets me going. So yeah, when I read this quote, I think it was my last year of my human rights degree, and it was just, yeah, and I had been to the UN already at a couple times, and it didn't matter, it didn't matter being in those high level spaces and with all of these important people, because at the end of the day, I still worry about my aunties and my cousins and my uncles and my family, and we worry about their safety. And as an Indigenous person, to be at the UN where and the times that I was there was right around Justin Trudeau being elected, and so there was a lot of Canada is back sort of discourse at the UN. And yeah, so I think that we need to move away from systems that rely on the state. And hopeful ending to the long talk on genocide. Sorry that I went a little bit longer than I wanted to. But I think for us, our future has to be returning to our legal orders. This is a photo I took. This is the first teepee I slept in ever in my life. I slept on a buffalo hide in there. I went to an Anishinaabe law camp with Professor John Burroughs, and that was after my first year of law school during the summer, and it was life-changing. It was my first time going to a sweat, going to ceremony, and that was, I think, the most healing thing, you know, like with all of the violence of law school, you know, being able to go to ceremony and to feel connected to my Anishinaabe ancestors and my Anishinaabe kin, and it really changed my trajectory in law school, and I think in a lot of ways gave me a lot of hope that I didn't really have after my first year. And so yeah, so let's look to our systems. Let's stop looking to the state, because they don't want to tell our stories. They're not interested. They've already told the story and they're the winners, and that's that. And I'm sure most folks listening know, you know, if you have a conversation with somebody who can't even see you as equal or see you as human the way that they are, it is very difficult to tell your truth without you know, without harming yourself, or without, you know, causing harm to yourself at the expense of someone else's education. And that's a really like big thing, I think, that we shouldn't have to be doing, you know, like as Indigenous peoples. It's not our job to validate our humanity to settlers who aren't interested in being wrong, or who are too afraid or don't have the courage to feel guilty for the ways that they benefit from our oppression. And so let's stop, like let's you know, move to our systems. And I think that's what makes me so fired up about Red River Echoes, is that it seems like a space where that can happen, and that all law is story, and that we have the power to tell new stories, and that we're telling them all the time in our art, in our beadwork, in our languages, and our talks. Everything that we do as Indigenous peoples, anytime we speak our truth, we're telling our stories, and we're telling new stories for the future generations to hear. And I think that that's, at least for me, I think that that's the future. I don't know if those other systems that are based on, you know, states and things that are so rigid, I don't think they have space for us as Indigenous peoples. I think my experience at the Senate, for, I guess, folks who don't know, but there was somebody who was falsely claiming to be Métis in the office when I was working at the Senate. And when I brought that to the attention of the senator, there was a lot of gaslighting and, you know, very deliberate effort to make me be quiet. I think a lot of Indigenous women probably can relate to that, of saying something that pisses somebody off and then people wanting you to be quiet. But I was raised by women who taught me not to be quiet, especially if something is wrong. And so, you know, we have to refuse to make ourselves smaller to fit into these systems, into these laws, into these courts that don't really care at the end of the day about the fullness of who we are. And I know for myself, like, I'm never going to I refuse to make my Métis-ness smaller to make other people comfortable. And, you know, I think the biggest thing that I think I'll just end with as sort of a story here. I noticed a lot of settlers, and I noticed this at the Senate in the ways that they tried to make me question, I guess, my own identity. Is I think some settlers have a hard time understanding the difference between I am a Métis person, or I am a person with Métis ancestry. I am not just Métis in the past, I am Métis in the present, and I'll be Métis in the future. And I think what's so complicated for Canadians is because their story is a story of genocide, and they don't think that we made it. You know, I don't think that they think that we have survived in this way. So we have an advantage here is because they actually underestimate us so much, and we have so much power in that. And I think we just need to harness that and keep telling our stories, keep, you know, being, when you're in those systems, you know, resist and take care of yourself and tell stories bravely, proudly, because that's what we need, and that's what's going to heal our people, and that's what will bring us justice. Marcy, I'm sorry that I went a little bit longer, but I will hang around for questions if anybody has.
Merci, Breanne, that was so beautiful. I'm going to pause the recording now so we can all jump in and share our impressions and just how awesome that was. I see some folks turn their cameras on also. That's great. I'm just going to stop the recording.